Today we're going to talk about tax treaties and more in particular what happens if there's no tax treaty between two countries. So Laurens, very briefly, what's a tax treaty?
Right, so a tax treaty is an agreement between two countries that make sure you don't pay tax twice, more or less, over the same income. And it also covers some other situations. So what if you live in Portugal 6 months, then you live in the UK for 6 months, you get income from both countries. For example, rental income from Portugal, dividends from the UK, and your employment is maybe in both countries even. Then that can become quite complicated for the question which country should tax that income, in which country are you a resident, because maybe in this example you're a resident, a tax resident in both countries because you meet the tax residency criteria in both countries. You spend a lot of time there, you have a lot of ties, for example, family, maybe you go to the dentist in one country but you have a gym subscription in the other country. Then the tax treaty appoints one of those countries as the winner, let's say, and then for the rest the structure of a tax treaty is always that you have all kinds of income sources, employment, self-employment, dividends, royalties, etc. And then it always, between two countries, for example, Portugal and the UK, it always looks at your residency country, your country of residence, and the source country. And the source country is the country where the income was generated, for example. And then it divides the taxation rights over all kinds of income, so rental income, self-employment income, even certain student income that you could have. And then in the country where you live, you have to file your worldwide income. In the country where the income is generated, you just have to file the income that the income sources that were generated in that country, and then the tax treaty makes sure you don't pay taxes twice.
Okay, so just an example for whom a tax treaty could be relevant. I live 6 months in the UK, 6 months in Portugal, and I want to know which country is going to see me as a tax resident, which is the primary country. That could be something I could find in a tax treaty. And also if I have income from, let's say, a rental apartment or an apartment in Lisbon, and if I have dividends from the UK, those kinds of questions. That's so also something I could find in a tax treaty where it will be taxed.
So where do you effectively end up paying which part of your taxes in which country, or maybe it's a portion in country A, so in the UK, and a portion in Portugal. And then you have what the tax treaty does, it's a double taxation agreement, so it makes sure you don't pay double taxes, either in the form of a credit or an exemption. So those are basically the two methods of avoiding double taxation.
Okay, so that's the introduction, but now we're going to the real subject of this episode, and that's what happens if such a tax treaty, which can be extremely useful, as we just discovered, what happens if that tax treaty does not exist?
I think the most straightforward thing, of course, is the double taxation risk that you could have. So if you have the UK, let's say you're a resident in the UK, and you have an income source in a country where the UK doesn't have a double taxation agreement with, then the UK could tax your worldwide income. That other country just taxes the income in itself. And if there's no mechanism to prevent double taxation, that means that you could be exposed to double taxation. Now, a few practical examples maybe of bigger countries that don't have a double taxation agreement with each other. The US and Brazil don't have one. The US and Hong Kong, for example. Portugal and Australia didn't have one, but they signed one quite recently. And Sweden cancelled 2 double taxation agreements with Greece and Portugal because they were not too happy with how pensions were taxed in those countries. So, for example, in the Sweden-Portugal scenario, there's a genuine risk of double taxation because there's no treaty that prevents the double taxation either in the form of a credit or an exemption. So that's like the main one. Then another one is that we already touched upon. So the tax treaty also provides tiebreaker rules, as they call it, for situations where you have dual residency. So if
so for example, Sweden thinks that you're a tax resident there because you're spending a lot of time in Sweden, but you're also spending a lot of time in Portugal, so they consider you tax resident there as well.
And normally, so if you spend 6 months in, for example, in Sweden, 6 months in Portugal.
And normally a tax treaty would then, according to tiebreaker rules, determine whether you're more of a tax resident in Sweden or in Portugal.
Yeah, and then you look at all kind of ties. Let's say, so where's your employment, for example? Where do you go to the dentist? Where's your gym subscription? Of which country are you a national? But the most important ones are, where do you have a permanent home? And where do you spend most of your time? And if there's no double taxation agreement and 2 countries see you as a tax resident, then you also don't have a mechanism indeed to appoint one of those countries as your main country of tax residence, in case there's a conflict between those countries, if they both claim you're a tax resident, but without a treaty. In principle, there's that risk.
Okay, so there's the risk that you don't know where you're tax, or that you're a tax resident in 2 countries, that you have double taxation as a result, and that you don't get automatic tax credits. So that's what could happen if there's no tax treaty. How could you avoid or reduce double taxation without a treaty? So let's say this is the situation. What can you do? You have a situation which is a little bit between Portugal and Sweden. So what could you advise those people?
Right. So if people, if you want to simulate what's going to happen, the first thing to look at is is there maybe anything in domestic law of either Portugal or Sweden or whatever country or countries that don't have a double taxation agreement with each other? Because under domestic law there could be let's say unilateral double taxation relief, or they could have some, for example, they could say, okay, foreign taxes paid can be subtracted.
So then the country just says, okay, we're not going to tax any income from the other country, whatever that other country is. It doesn't matter whether we have a tax treaty with that other country.
And then sometimes they exclude blacklisted tax havens where there's 0% income tax, for example. Or they align with the OECD model treaty, which is it's like a model tax treaty where most tax treaties are based on by the OECD. So that's one. So you first you can check, is there anything under domestic law that unilaterally provides double taxation relief? So for example, the US and the UK, they have all these kinds of mechanisms. If it's more in the dual residency sphere, you can also check, is it actually correct that you are a resident in both countries?
Because maybe you're assuming that both countries think that you're a tax resident, but if you look carefully, maybe one country will see you as a tax resident and the other won't.
Yeah, or you can have, for example, like a residency certificate in country A, or you can effectively prove that you're actually a resident elsewhere, or maybe non-residence is automatically assumed if you stay less than X days and then in that country. So you can already talk to the tax authorities in those countries yourself. And then also, and this is a bit what we mentioned under point 1 as well, often, for example, for foreign royalties, interest, dividends, countries also have unilateral ways of preventing double taxation by just saying, okay, foreign, for example, on royalties, dividends, or interest, those ones can be credited, for example.
So unilateral is an important word here. It means that you look for benefits that you get regardless of what the other country is, regardless of whether there's a tax treaty with that other country. Those benefits could still be yours or will still be yours, even if there's no tax treaty in place. Right, that's all clear, I think. So we have a few other questions that often come up in this regard. So let's go to them. What types of income are most vulnerable to double taxation?
Right. So even if there is a double taxation agreement, by the way, sometimes there could be double taxation. But yeah, now we're focusing most on a situation where you don't
because
have
then you have a double tax treaty between the countries,
yeah,
but you still have double taxation.
Yeah, it could be that two countries disagree, for example, on what the income is. So maybe one country says this income is, I don't know, let's say if you're talking about certain stock options that you get during employment, they could have a qualification disagreement. So country A says, okay, this is X, and country B says this is Y. So you can have those kind of things. And
then each country qualifies it as a kind of income that they can tax, and then they will both, because they have a different qualification, they could still end up taxing you both.
Yeah, or maybe on rental income, for example, that some country has some kind of law that it is not strictly rental income, but it's more some kind of wealth tax on the property, but it really feels like rental income, and then you cannot subtract that, for example, from the other country. Like all these kinds of situations are imaginable. But yeah, for the rest, if you look at employment income, for example, or self-employment income, that's often if you move to another country and, for example, your foreign employer is always withholding taxes for you, but you move to another country and you, for example, forget to say to your employer that they should stop withholding those taxes, then you can have those kind of situations. Or if you didn't deregister from a country before coming to the country. And it can all be repaired if there's a double taxation agreement, of course. It's just not as easy as it looks, you know, because
you've created a complicated situation, so you need to clean up the mess.
Exactly, and then if there's no tax treaty, it's even harder. Then you can also look at, for example, interest. If you like, sometimes people have to pay if you have some stocks or whatever, you get interest. People have to pay a certain withholding tax on that. Then, according to the double taxation agreement, actually that withholding tax can be lowered. But people forget to get that. You know, the double taxation relief, because, for example, they don't know about it. So then it's also a little bit your own fault that there's double taxation. Yes, and it's your own fault, and it's also just difficult, I guess. Because you don't want all the paperwork, or let's say if it's about 150 euros, are you really going
to go through the whole bureaucracy only for 150 euros? So employment income, dividends, interest. So talking about income that's vulnerable to double taxation, self-employment income, and I think we discussed rental income as well. Okay. So last question that's also relevant here: is there any international guidance or international guidelines that you can rely on to get a better understanding?
It's that OECD model treaty that I already mentioned. So that's not legally binding, but most tax treaties are based on the OECD model treaty. And sometimes countries just look at, for example, if there's no tax treaty, they look at, okay, what would it have been under the OECD model treaty, and they just simulate a situation as if it were the OECD model treaty. And then there could still be double taxation relief, for example. So the OECD model treaty is like a template that many countries use for their tax treaties. They base it on the standard tax that they have in the model treaty, and then they change it a little bit at some places. And if there is no tax treaty, then you can just go back to the template and argue that should be applied. Okay. Then I think we already talked a lot, almost 15 minutes, about tax treaties and the absence of tax treaties. So let's leave it there for today. And if you have any questions, as always, you can visit us at Tytle.io, and we're very happy to assist you with any questions you may have. And hope to see you next time. Bye.